Hi, thank you so much, Arthur, for this. Is really fun. I forgot my water. I'm going to read from my paper just because 10 minutes, I'm really afraid if I don't read, it'll just go past the 10 minutes. So I'll be speaking about one body of work today of mine because I just found out that this is called the digital sublime, and I thought, okay, well, the only body of work that I really can talk about in terms of the sublime is this one, Suns from Flickr. On the universal, what is it called? The Photographic Universe website, there's a video by Flusser, or of Flusser, an excerpt, and Flusser says, there is the stream of events as it is perceived by historical consciousness. Everything flows, nothing ever repeats itself. Every opportunity lost is lost forever. Everybody within this stream of events, or everybody is within this stream of events. Above, and he does this with his hand, above is science. Above it is science. Science formulates eternal, timeless, and spaceless algorithm. And the whole of scientific and technological knowledge is in this formal trans-historical region. Now, in that region, you build a machine, and that machine delves into history. He does this with his hands, and takes a part of the history and lifts it to this trans-historical level. This is a photograph. So I assume he means all photographs or any photograph, such as this one on the Wikipedia page. And he's proposing a kind of vertical formulation of thinking about photography. It's the photograph that takes what's on the ground, that's in the stream of events, and elevates it to a kind of iconic status. One could say that we make and look at images in this kind of way to understand and connect with the world, especially if we don't really understand the world or don't connect to the world. But I'm curious about a horizontal formulation of the photograph. And so I'm thinking about I'm curious about all formulations of photography because photography is the subject that I work with. But if we have a vertical formulation, then what does a horizontal formulation look like? And so I'm thinking about the social functionality of photographs and how, for instance, photographs on cell phones and Facebook, how they kind of allow for a visibility, a connection to others, a kind of intimacy or an empathy with others. And in most cases, this is, like, this is my daughter's, this is my dog. This is the kind of photography that lives on a kind of horizontal, in a kind of horizontal relationship to other photographs. And so what happens when these photographs are, okay, I'm going to get back to my reading. In the context of the internet, what do either of these formulations of photography mean when the casual, the private moments, mixed with sunsets, still lives, commercial and stock images, news events, and porn? I really need some water. I'm going to get... And now you'll see how nervous I am because I can't even hold this. Ah! I need a bottle of water is what I really need. Okay, hold on. Or a scotch. Okay. So the first and foremost question I think that this has to do with is how we use images, how we make and produce and share images. See, we're not in the show here, right? Hold on. I have this, okay, we'll go here. All right. In a recent New York Times article, Facebook, they cite Facebook as saying that since the site was founded in 2004, its users have uploaded more than 50 million photos. And Flickr says that its users add more than 3 million photos to its inventory every day. I like the idea that the number itself is sublime, like that how we actually visualize pictures. I mean, can you actually visualize that many pictures? It's completely incomprehensible. So that's a kind of sublime relationship to the image. And so what are these pictures of? Today, there are more than 8 million pictures of images with the term baby, more than 12 million with the term friend, more than 12 million with the term love, more than 9 million with the term vacation. For the Grand Canyon, there's more than 1 million. So I've got this up here because in his book called, I forget the name of the book, but in the essay called The Loss of Creature, Walker Percy writes, this is kind of a long quote, but it's good. Garcia Lopez de Cardenas discovered the Grand Canyon and was amazed by the sight. It can be imagined. One crosses miles of desert, breaks into the mesquite, and there it is at one's feet. Does not one see the same sight from the bright Angel Lodge as Cardenas saw? The assumption is that the Grand Canyon is remarkably interesting and beautiful, and that if it had a certain value P for Cardenas, the same value P may be transmitted to any number of sightseers, just as Banting's discovery of insulin can be transmitted to any number of diabetics. How come this isn't going forward? It's crashed. Do I have to do that each time?
Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, it should be going
Okay.
straight to
Well, let's.
maybe the space bar.
Okay, let's leave it there because. Okay, we'll leave it there, and if it doesn't work, then the next time I get extra minutes for this. Where am I? Okay, a counter-influence is at work, however. It would be nearer the truth to say that if the place is seen by 1 million sightseers, a single sightseer does not receive value P, but 1/millionth of value P. The Grand Canyon. Okay, so let's get out of here.
We should exit out.
Oh, it's not even exiting. It's pretty.
Let's restart it.
Okay. Yay, okay. All right, so the Grand Canyon, the thing as it is, has been appropriated by the symbolic complex, which has already been formed in the sightseer's mind. A picture postcard, a geography book, tourist folders, the word Grand Canyon. Okay, so these are all pictures from Flickr. There are 8,175,204 images of sunset on Flickr. Can any one individual image express the sublime anymore? We know all of these images. Could we say that the numbers of images of all the same thing, along with the programmed technological means of their production, has become a kind of sublime? We know that the more normalized technologies become, the more invisible they are to their users, and in most cases, one need not have any interest in, need not know, or often cannot know, the experience of actually being there, the implications of the image, or the workings behind its technology. To quote Flusser again, we live in an expanding universe. The media offer us more and more things of which we can have no immediate experience and take away one by one the things which we can communicate directly. We may have no experience with any of these kinds of things, but we are nonetheless determined by them. In its sheer quantity and availability of anything remotely individual, it's the sheer quantity and availability of anything remotely individual that neutralizes the personal, the particular, the individual, the local, into an abstract, collective, generic, and global. This is where the sheer numbers for me, this is where the photograph and the image and the photographer in this kind of photography stop having agency and cannot claim any individuality or uniqueness. And it's a point where all the images become data, as in Flusser's horizontal stream. So what does it mean? that family and love and sunset are hugely shared on Flickr. On the same day that I did all those searches, there were 69,467,385 images tagged with the word "me" in them. And so I see this as a kind of, my interpretation of that is that it's a kind of a claim towards individuality and a kind of plea for insistence of selfhood. But it's kind of, for me, it's a very kind of sad plea when all the images look so similar. So in 2006, when I started this project with Flickr, I searched a number of different things, and sunsets were the most photographed on Flickr, the most tagged on Flickr. So I decided that, well, what was the most interesting about that was the subject of the photograph, the fact that the subject of the sun, oh my God, it's red. Okay, but that's not fair. We have to start. All right, was the subject of the sun. Can I take 2 minutes? So I downloaded all the sun photographs, and I cropped just the suns from them and made suns from Flickr, which are just the suns from the sunset images you see here. And the thing that's really interesting to me is, oh, that's funny. I think that's a PowerPoint thing. But anyway, it's all off register. These are the numbers of sun images. Yeah, but things are missing in that, so I'm just going to skip that. The thing that's interesting to me about this project, actually, is that people have started taking their pictures in front of the installations just the way people were taking pictures of the sunset. And not only that, like, this is a really interesting, these guys are taking pictures of each other, and then I found on Flickr all these pictures. So those two on the very top, on the left, are the same two. Someone else took a picture of them taking pictures, and these are the pictures that they posted. So I guess what I want to say actually about this is going back to this idea of taking then a picture of yourself in front of the sunset. I really just need to say this last little line. I hope that's okay. This last little bit, and that is that the figure, the subject here, has been emptied out of a kind of individuality because these photographs are all the same as all the other photographs, more or less. They're not like, I know that these photographs are being carried around on people's phones, but they're also being shared with people on the internet among all the millions of other images that are being shared with people. And I wonder what it means to actually, if we identify with the subjects in a photograph, then what are we doing by putting ourselves in this context? And there's an aspect to it, to me, that has to do with the first intent of the photograph is to say, I am here, it's my birthday, I love you, I want to show you where I am. But in fact, what happens when seen together is, in fact, the exact opposite. It's like, we're here, we're all here, we're here all the time, we're everywhere, forever. And it is, in a sense, the eternal, timeless, spaceless algorithm that Flickr talks about. And it's about occupying the sublime, in a sense.
Well, good afternoon. I just want to echo the thanks that other speakers have extended to Arthur O. For a really outstanding conference and for the opportunity to be part of a really, really interesting conversation. And thanks to all of you who've been contributing to that. Today, in my brief formal remarks, I wish to address the contemporary status of photographic indexicality by exploring the medium's changing relationship to the portrait and models of subjectivity. As Rosalind Krauss has observed, quote, every photograph is the result of a physical imprint transferred by light onto a sensitive surface. The photograph is thus a type of icon or visual likeness, which bears an indexical relationship to its object, close quotes. Krauss's remarks elucidate the special authority long enjoyed by the conventional photograph. Its widespread association with truth largely relied upon its capacity to record through lenses naturalistic images that were also understood to have been imprinted chemically. In the words of Roland Barthes, the photograph's essence is to ratify what it represents. The special power of the index to capture something otherwise fleeting in time is not exclusive to the photograph, of course. One thinks, for example, of religious relics, such as the blood of Saint Januarius, or the sentimental lock of hair. Such objects do not necessarily bear an iconic relationship to the individuals that they represent. C.S. Peirce reminds us that an indexical sign need, quote, have no significant resemblance to its objects, but instead, psychologically, depends upon association by contiguity, close quotes. The index's authority, then, is not pictorial, but substantive, conveying something about the real physical presence of a body without necessarily describing its appearance. For centuries, Western portraiture has reflected a desire to fix concrete indexical evidence of human life. This aim takes shape in the origin myths of the genre, which, much like those of photography, stress links to shadows and mirror reflections. Portraiture, Pliny tells us, was invented when a young maiden sought to record the likeness of her departing lover by tracing his silhouette onto a wall, a tale illustrated here by Joseph Wright. Dürer testified to the indexical origins of his first self-portrait with the inscription that you see noted in the upper right of that drawing. This I fashioned after myself out of a mirror in the year 1484, when I was still a child. The implied link between appearance and character, one functioning as a sign of the other, helped secure the assumption that pictorial likeness could perform as a viable representation of the portrait subject and his or her character. It was largely on this basis that photography, with its capacity to capture facial features mechanically through optics and chemistry, came to serve as a documentary tool par excellence, recording likeness not only for social purposes, but perhaps even more importantly, for documentary ones, as suggested by this 1865 wanted poster for John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices in the assassination of President Lincoln, and by this 1925 photograph and accompanying pedigree for the gangster Al Scarface Capone. But despite photography's influential sway, by the 1920s, even as the New York City Police Department carefully recorded Capone's features, evidence of the erosion of photography's persuasiveness was readily evident. Perhaps nowhere more so than in Marcel Duchamp's iconoclastic wanted $2,000 reward of 1923. Looking closely, one notes that although photographs of Duchamp's face in profile and facing front are prominently displayed, his own name appears nowhere on the poster. Instead, one encounters a succession of aliases, concluding with that of his well-known female alter ego, Eros C'est la Vie. The resonance of Duchamp's coy undermining of the authority of photography is indicated by the numerous appropriations it has inspired from the 1950s to the present, as in these riffs by Julian Levy, Richard Pettibone, Sturtevant, and Gavin Turk. Prefiguring the death of photography as a transparent marker of the real, Duchamp's Wanted also posited the proliferation of personal identities associated with a single individual, announcing the destabilization of the model of the unified subject. Duchamp's Wanted poster raises two critical intertwined questions. First, just what does the photograph index? And to what extent is its frozen image capable of adequately representing the human subject? Such questions would take on additional force in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s as the limits of the medium became apparent through the broad spread of television and the advent of the digitized photograph. If the medium is the message, to invoke Marshall McLuhan's famous observation, today, as Richard Schiff has observed, the medium has become a problem. Why, asks Schiff? I quote, "Perhaps because of the shock of a succession of new representational technologies, some analog, some digital, lithography, photography, the telephone, sound recording, cinema, television, computer imaging. All these everyday technologies lead us into the techno-sublime. The techno-sublime, as defined by Schiff, constitutes a state of disorientation, an inability to channel one's sensorial response into the proper channels. This occurs when any technology, like an ideological structure, ceases to be invisible, as photography was for so long. That is, when it no longer functions as a given in our lives. Some insight into just such a historical moment, the point at which photography broke down to be subsumed by a conceptual reordering brought about by the digital computer, is provided by Chuck Close, who recently observed that he still had a Scientific American from 1973 that was on the newsstand the very day he went to the opening of his first exhibition of dot drawings at the Bikert Gallery. The first of these works was Keith, 1280, where the number refers to the number of squares in the grid. While emphasizing that the pictorial parallel was not deliberate, Close acknowledged the conceptual similarity to the computerized image, explaining, "There's no question that life in the 20th century is about imaging. It's about photography. It's about film. And it is about new digitalized things. There are layers of similarity, I suppose, that have to do with the way computer-generated imagery is made from scanning. I scan the photograph as well, and I break it down into incremental bits." Arguably, Close's very ability to absorb the lessons of digitization without explicitly embracing the computer is all the more testament to the deep degree to which it had infiltrated thinking about image making, even by the early 1970s. Just as digitization was reorienting our understanding of the picture, so too were leading post-structural theorists such as Barthes, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, recasting our understanding of the self, breaking down the long-standing assumption of authorial integrity, and developing instead a model of the subject as dispersed and decentered. Indeed, the very model of self to which we are now largely heir reflects computer-based metaphors. Consider Judith Butler's influential description of the functioning of identity, for example. She argues, and I quote, "To qualify as a substantive identity is an arduous task, for such appearances are rule-generated. Indeed, to understand identity as a practice, and a signifying practice, is to understand culturally intelligible subjects as resulting from the effects of rule-bound discourse. Understood as a series of coded behaviors, identity, cast as something performative but also programmed, can readily be correlated with contemporary imaging technologies. The rules associated with such pictorial data can be shifted at will, frequently defying ready decipherment. The photographic index need therefore no longer imply a traditionally naturalistic image. Self-portraits of Tom Friedman and Jason Salavon, for example, read as abstractions. Tom Friedman's, Untitled of 1998, began as a profile of his full body, scanned into the computer. Friedman then developed code to stretch each pixel outward, producing an image that, while containing the visual information needed to see the artist, is at the same time utterly unrecognizable. In Flayed Figure Male, Salavon presents a digital mosaic of his body, composed of half-inch squares of flesh, arranged according to tonality. The work is the same height as the artist. A detail at right reveals the patches of Salavon's skin visible to the viewer. Visible to the viewer. As the artist explains, the resulting object is a photograph of the entire surface of my skin, reproduced to scale and reconfigured so as to reveal the most intimate physical detail while obliterating my individual identity. In an era when photographic information becomes data, the photograph's traditional indexical power is transformed, though it does not cease to signify as such. Correspondingly, our very assumptions about subjecthood have themselves shifted away from something essential to something in perpetual flux. In 1980, expressing his concern over the photograph, Roland Barthes noted, "Myself never coincides with my image, for it is the image which is heavy, motionless, stubborn, which is why society sustains it, and myself, which is light, divided, dispersed. Like a bottle imp, myself doesn't hold still, giggling in my jar. If only photography could give me a neutral anatomic body, a body which signifies nothing." Arguably, the potential to reorient the picture at will provides just such flexibility, including the potential to obliterate the body, even while representing it. Seen side by side, the evolution of pictorial technology and models of selfhood suggest the burgeoning of a new interpretive paradigm for both the photograph and its subject, and the value of renewed attentiveness to their interrelationship. Thank you. Really a pleasure and a privilege to have a chance to speak with Penelope this afternoon. And we're sort of, I think, in a slightly different relationship to one another than some of the other speakers this afternoon. In fact, we just had an opportunity to meet last night for the first time. So this is definitely going to be a very spontaneous conversation as we get to know one another a little bit better and get to know each other's work a little better. And we'll definitely look forward to hearing from the audience as well. One of the things that Penelope and I were chatting about just a little bit before we did our presentations was this question of photographic seeing, which was something that Arthur suggested that we might consider. And we began comparing notes a little bit on this question of has the digitization of photography changed photographic seeing? And if that's the case, is it possible to locate a moment in time where we might be able to say, yes, that's the moment where we think things shifted? And
you had said something about 1960. Yeah, and did you want to?
You go right ahead.
Okay. No, I actually been talking to Leslie about this recently also. This kind of realization that all my students, my undergrad students, were of a particular age. We had a conversation in one of my undergrad classes about this exact thing. They're all of an age that had film photographs taken of them for the first 6 years of their lives, and then all of a sudden everything was digital. And so and my daughters are also that age. So we have, 6 years of negative images that are made from negatives that are paper on the beautiful objects of the flat piece of paper. And then everything else is on hard drives. And there's a kind of, I perceive, and we talked about this in my undergrad class, this kind of anxiety of the immateriality of the representation of the self in a way that changes right then for that one generation, and who knows what it will be like for the generations that never had themselves presenced in physical form the way this generation and everybody before that did. And, well, since the camera was invented, but.
Yeah, I think it raises really interesting questions actually about the ontology of the photographic image and how what we understand that ontology to be. And one of the things, Penelope, that you've gotten me thinking about, which I find really interesting, is the degree to which the use of the photograph and the proliferation of the photograph just on the basis of individual consumption of it really changes what it means very profoundly.
Right. It's actually become, I think what's interesting about the digital image now is that it's a moving image. It's a still, but it's moving constantly. It's on my cell phone. I can email it to people. It can be everywhere in a way that no paper image. It actually makes photography, negative-based photography, seem singular. Mm-hmm. You know, so coming out of a Benjamin argument about the multiplicity, the reproducibility, the mechanical reproducibility of a photograph, it actually starts to seem non-reproducible in a sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was preparing for today's comments, I have to say I benefited tremendously from this wonderful website that Arthur has put together, and it was a lot of fun to go back and look at the videotaped interview with Derrida, which I believe dates to 1993, and I was struck by Derrida's association of the photograph with, quote unquote, death effect, and
right.
Of course Barth and camera lucida immediately sprung to mind, and I couldn't help but be struck when I was rereading that essay, Barth's essay, in preparation for this afternoon's conversation about this notion of the solidity, the heaviness of the photographic image, the idea that traditionally there has been this notion of stasis associated with the photograph, and the degree to which that contributed to this metaphor of death being associated with it. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and whether you feel that they're really the immateriality or the dematerialization of the photographic substrate sort of changes metaphors of that nature.
It's interesting, especially in relation to Andrea's talk about the photograph that then represents something that's going on now, and understanding it as being a present thing, because it does have that relationship to this was there then, even though Andrea wants it to represent something that's happening now also. And I guess we're talking about two different things then, when we're talking about the weight of the photograph that points to a time that then has this kind of relationship to death, as opposed to the weight of the political meaning of the subject of the photograph, and how that actually is maybe eternal. I don't, I mean, it depends on what the subject is, I guess, or what, does that, I mean, how do you...
Well, it's funny. I think another element of Derrida's comment about his resistance for many years to actually allowing his photograph to spread, which was kind of interesting, not only had to do with this notion of stasis, perhaps, but also the idea that he wanted to resist the idea of the fetish of the art of the author being fetishized, and that makes a lot of sense when we think about Derrida's philosophical work. But he also talked about his resistance to being sort of cast in a photographic sense into the role of author, that you're photographed and there's a bookcase in the background, or there's just a particular trope that we associate with what it means to be author.
Right.
And so actually then, in a curious way, it's kind of interesting, keeping that notion in mind, to see the proliferation of very specific paradigms or stereotypes, if you will, through the photographic images, particularly that you've captured, that they're just...
It's also interesting in relation to Derrida, because he talks about, well, in fact, it really is because I'm vain and I'm self-conscious about what I look like. And in fact, that's actually really relevant to the fact that, like, I mean, everybody wants to be presenced, I guess. And so it's a kind of odd inversion that I forget the word that he uses, but yeah.
It's interesting.
No, well, I'm curious about... well, what were you going to say?
Oh, well, just thinking again about the gathering of images and this question of what they index. I loved your point early on in your presentation about the sublimity of the number of images that you've been able to locate of sunsets, and then I think you've also done a fabulous series on birthday cakes. But I mean, it's sort of interesting then again, I think, to think about this issue of what does the photograph index in this era of data.
Right, the birthday cakes is really interesting to me, I mean, I would never have done it had the Times not asked for a piece that, you know, but it is kind of amazing how everybody stages the birthday party for the cake, and we all know that. But then when you see that many cakes with those many candles on them and everybody standing in front of them, it's quite beautiful and poetic. I mean, I actually think there's something interestingly poetic and beautiful about all the sunset images too. And this comes to the author, you know, the sense that you're authoring something new and individual is the thing that I'm curious about. Not so much the fact that we all take pictures of sunsets. I think that's quite beautiful that we do that, or that we all take pictures of cakes, you know. But which is interesting in relation to Duchamp, actually, because he was probably the first, he's kind of the father of the questioning of authorship on that level.
Yeah, I think he certainly, I think had was very much invested in rethinking notions of originality and this question of maybe the paradigms that we adopt to describe originality. I think that there have been some interesting questions raised already in the conference about issues of photographic meaning and the content of these of this meaning, and this issue of the role of the beholder versus the artist, the intentionality of the artist. And I think one of the things that I find very attractive about Duchamp's approach to authorship, as well as, you know, I think being very influential, and in fact he really anticipates Barthes and Derrida and Foucault in this regard, I think, with his creative act speech in the late 50s, in terms of really making the point very strongly that it's the viewer rather, who will bestow meaning upon the work of art, and that ultimately, from Duchamp's standpoint, it's the author or the reader, the viewer, ultimately, who comes down the line, posterity, who's going to determine what is meaningful. And I guess that actually, in a sense, raises this question of witnessing and what it means to bear witness. If we ascribe to the viewer or to the reader the ability to describe meaning in images that anyone produces, or works of art and of any sort, I think one of the things that we're describing is the accessibility of those images or those moments to members of a future generation. And to my mind, that also raises some interesting questions about what it means to bear witness, or the assumption of the significance of bearing witness that is testified to by this impulse that evidently millions of people have to slap their photographs up on the web, even though they're not particularly original.
Right.
And you know, but this notion that somehow meaning is to be found in those images being validated by somebody looking at them is quite intriguing.
It's there's a whole other project that it speaks that kind of validation to an anonymous public, or from an anonymous public. The fact that you know that someone might be seeing that I think is the contemporary digital way of seeing. It's seeing something without being seen, and also knowing someone will see without you seeing them, in a way that I don't think there's an equivalent before we had the internet. You know, you could put a mask on and not see, and someone could see you, but there's still the physical being in the space and smelling, and there's a tactility even with the mask. You know, so there's something oddly disconnected, and I like to think in terms of the idea of autism, like a parallel kind of non-empathetic relationship to that kind of putting of an image out there to share with someone you have no idea who you're sharing it with.
Do you think that there is a sense that those images might somehow be creatively misunderstood? Or is there a sense, do you think, on the part of people putting up their images, that there's something secure about especially these sort of time-worn tropes of myself and my husband or my kids in front of the sunset, or the birthday cake, or that type of thing? I'm curious. I don't know. I mean, I think there's some images that I do think people are putting images up. For instance, I have this web piece called Beautiful Armoire, Perfect Condition. And it's basically, it starts off with a
an armoire that's from Pottery Barn, and then I found a million armoires in varying degrees of degradation, people selling on Craigslist, and I kind of sequenced them from the ones that look the most like the Pottery Barn ad to the ones that are like just incredible, like you just cannot understand how anybody would put an image up on the web to sell their armoire. You can't even see the armoire, it's just filled with, all sorts of crap. And the idea of the piece was to, if you were looking for an armoire, you would find this site maybe, and you'd click through them all, and by the end of it, you go like, okay, this is not going to help me, It's not. But I started to think about these pictures. These pictures are really clearly stating something other than the effect of the armoire. There's dirty underwear, there's pictures of family pinned up, there's this kind of slight sort of secretive expression. It's almost as though they're flashing, there's this kind of intimacy and privacy in these images that to sell an armoire might be the first, maybe the text of putting the image there, but the subtext is, look at my private life, look at how busy I am, or look at my dirty underwear hanging on my, or this is my bed, this is my cat. I think there's something there that isn't intentional, but it's sort of sub-intentional. It's like a subconscious drive or a subconscious yearning for connection somehow. Does that?
Yeah, and I'm also interested, when you began your remarks earlier, you used this metaphor of horizontality and verticality, and could you expand a little bit on those notions of the organization of information, and then maybe explain how that might relate to a project like the Armoire project?
Yeah, I guess I was using horizontality and verticality in terms of the kind of photograph that I was looking at. So I'm not looking at a photograph that attempts to be a kind of have a vertical relationship to culture, and that it kind of, I'm not looking at images that someone like James Welling would make or Andrea Geiger would make. I'm looking at images that that people are making because they can, and they're not really thinking too much about. And to me, that's a kind of very horizontal practice in the cultural practice of making photographs. The armoire piece is actually, in a kind of weird way, a vertical piece, because it actually starts somewhere and goes somewhere, and it tries to arrive somewhere. But I think of, I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I think it actually has maybe something to do with this idea of seeing, and that a kind of perspectival way of seeing, single point perspective, has a hierarchy, but a scanner has no hierarchy. And there's a kind of interesting correlation between no hierarchy and the kind of pedestrian photography, practices in photography that we all participate in. Which is also horizontal. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And it also raises in my mind, again, a question that Arthur had sort of planted in my mind about this notion of the use of photography versus the production of photography. And it strikes me that your work does really interesting things playing with that relationship, particularly as you cruise the internet and do some of these searches for metadata and so forth to pull up bodies of images that maybe begin to give you some ideas about how information is organized or lead to the production of a piece like the Sunset work. And so I guess another question in terms of if we think about seeing as a metaphor for how information is organized, what it means to think about the photograph or photographs as this database that now begins to exist for artistic appropriation and that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that there is a lot of, that people are just putting images on the internet without really thinking about what those images are means that someone who is thinking about what the images are can use those, can find something out about who we are and how we picture ourselves. So it does become a database in a way that artists' websites are not databases. They may be a database of, maybe all the artists' websites are is a database of what artists are doing now. It could be, but Flickr is a database of how people think about photographs, which is, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting in terms of this turning inside out, as you mentioned earlier, of notions of the public and the private self and how those circulate. And it also, I think, does raise sort of interesting questions about obsolescence. And I think nowadays it's very easy to be aware of the obsolescence of certain photographic technologies, but then to think about where these types of databases are taking us and the degree to which we are plugging ourselves into things like Facebook, things like Flickr, and the question about what the future of those types of repository of information might be raises really interesting questions. I think especially for artists who might see a tool like Flickr as a place where art can live. And what does that mean in terms of the potential for these projects to live, or to be putting themselves into some relationship with what we can anticipate is going to be some type of technological obsolescence?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea of, does that mean that we have to, the lights are really, okay. I think the thing about where art can, Flickr can be a place that art can be maybe presented, and there are actually artists that do projects on Flickr, using Flickr as a site, a platform to engage, and that is the art. There's a kind of, I think this question got raised, I think, a little bit in Jim and Walter's piece, talk about, whether you use Photoshop as a means and an end, or if you're using it just as a tool to get to somewhere, or if it's about Photoshop, or, Flickr you can make pieces about Flickr, and then the piece becomes obsolete when Flickr is obsolete. Or you can make pieces and put them on Flickr, and then you just find another place to put them when Flickr becomes obsolete. It's an interesting thing that the technologies are constantly changing, and so we're having to think about archival aspects. But.
Right. I think the yellow light means that it's time to open this up to the audience.
Or does it mean that we're audience?
Yeah.
There's a question over here in the front.
Thanks. So I found the project that you're doing extremely fascinating, partly because I work on contemporary poetry, and certainly it's a kind of privileged sort of, arena for things like self-expression. And I guess I wonder if you think it would be possible. I was particularly struck by the kind of pathos you produced around what seems like a kind of failure of individuality in this project. And if you rotate the view just slightly, and maybe even rotate it according to some of what was said in the previous panel, it starts to look like it's not so much a loss of individuality as a kind of hyper manifestation of a commitment to individuality.
A kind of narcissism.
Yeah, and I mean, then it looks like this project is just a kind of fascinating window onto a set of issues that might map onto the kind of political history that we were talking about earlier. So instead of sort of generating pathos around that sort of sense of a loss of individuality, I wonder if it would be possible to generate a kind of political interest in the commitment to individuality that your project reveals.
But that's a really interesting question in terms of intentionality. It's like, but that wouldn't be my intention, I'm not really interested in that aspect. What I'm really interested in is disappearance as opposed to narcissism, or hyper individuality. But yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely one could. That's what's kind of great about the idea of images on the internet as being data. Because you can the reason they can be data, or the reason you can call them data, is because you can pretty well do anything with them you want. I mean, within reason, but I mean, I can say that they mean this and then push them in that direction. And you could say they mean this and push them in your direction. I think. That didn't answer your question, sorry. Okay.
Question in the center here.
Thanks for your presentations. I'm wondering, excuse me, I know that there's this kind of strange quality that the image has. It gets decontextualized, right? You know, in many ways, it just gets put out there, and then it loses its context, and it loses everything that led up to making it. And that's one of the tensions, I guess, in the image. But I am wondering about the role of experience, you know, the experience that people have when they see the Grand Canyon. I remember when I first saw the Taj Mahal, it was nothing like I had ever seen in photographs. So I'm wondering about that experience and how that gets integrated, or, you know, the phenomenological aspect of it, of taking the picture, being there, creating the image, and then the context in which people make these images, and how that dialogues, if there's any place for that in your understanding and in your critiques.
I could just say that I agree. You know, I'm not actually saying that the experience is. I was quoting Percy by saying it's a millionth of the. I actually do agree with that on to a certain extent, but I also think, you know, there are times, and we've all had this, where we've seen photographs of things or seen things or know they exist, and then you go and it's not nearly what you thought it would be, that you imagined it to be from all the photographs you've seen. So it can happen the other way. But yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah, it's. I think you raise a really interesting question, and I have to say, you know, Penelope's work I find very thought-provoking for a lot of reasons, and I think in relation to this notion, or these old, you know, relatively old categories of the sublime and the beautiful, it raises some sort of interesting questions as well. Because of course, the sublime is really about this moment of having this sensation of being somehow overwhelmed by something which is more powerful than the self, and I don't know to what degree this is intentional in your practice, but it is interesting to think about, you know, what is the status of an image of the sunset or an image of the Grand Canyon? Because presumably, especially if, you know, one's standing on the beach and so forth, these are conceivably attempts to try to position the self within relation to something which is obviously bigger than it, more overwhelming than it, precedes it, and is going to live beyond it in terms of temporality. And yet, obviously, we begin to realize, if we sort of take an anthropological perspective on Penelope's projects, that there is some type of sort of quote-unquote photographic seeing, which is obviously so deeply integrated into our consciousnesses that probably without even realizing we're doing it, we are all sort of compelled to use the camera to register those moments, and not just to register them, but to register them in really predictable ways. And then what becomes sort of intriguing to me conceptually is that a project like Penelope's sort of changes the terms of that indexicality, so that instead of it feeling overwhelmed by nature and natural forces, it's suddenly possible to have this sense of being overwhelmed by members of our own species, by people, by this practice. And I'm not quite sure exactly what to make of that yet, but I do find that these types of inversions become really quite intriguing. So I think your question is quite thought-provoking.
That's really nice thinking about the work that way, and it also raises the idea that the overwhelming, if we use the sunset, for example, the overwhelmingness of it actually can't possibly be experienced by the person who's taking the photograph. Which is the photograph that I'm taking, because there's the photograph between the thing and the person, or the camera between it's always for the photograph, as you say. So there's a kind of, well, maybe you found the experience sublime, but the photographs that I'm finding, those people are not finding that experience sublime. They're actually using the experience to make the photograph to then put on the website. So, yeah.
There's a question in the middle here.
My question actually might have been talked about in this discussion you were referring to with your students. But I was wondering if you've looked into it all, the notion of this hyper-individuality when the subject dies, like particularly within a social network, if our relationship to the photograph dies or the subject.
It's for
Well, I
probably
guess it was
for
more.
Penelope.
Yeah,
But
I guess.
am I remembering right, Penelope? Did you do a project for the New York Times that illustrated an article that actually dealt with that very issue?
Accompanied an
I thought so
article.
earlier this year, right?
Yeah. The article was called "Ghost in the Machine," and it was just the most appropriate article to have my work accompany. And but it was about digital. It was about what happens to the digital identity online when someone dies. But what was your question was? What?
Well, I guess I'm more interested in the fact that this particular generation that's sort of hyper-represented, particularly with on Facebook or something like that, if there's any notion of like memorial with these photographs once the person is deceased.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
People are beginning to grapple with it now.
Yeah, it's a really, you should, if you're interested in that question, you should read that article in the New York Times, and you'll see more of my work. You'll see those sunsets.
Yeah, I think that question is really interesting, though, in terms of archival practices, because I do think that maybe there's this sort of implicit understanding that these works are somehow going to live on forever, God knows where, but that our Facebook pages aren't going to disappear, or if we post something to Flickr, it's going to be there forever. And then I think that, this question that, in a sense, I think Duchamp, but certainly not Duchamp alone, was getting at, in terms of what exactly is being indexed here and how does that function and what does it mean when the context is utterly lost and when perhaps we can't even trace it back to a particular origin. It becomes quite interesting.
We'll take one more question over here.
When your collection of the sun images went up, it struck me that one of the singular elements that really came bright is the role of the editor and the role of the technology. I would argue that the individual points about the merit of the images,
But the what?
the merit of the singular images, has not shifted at all. Anyone that's wandered around garage sales or antique stores and looked through boxes of family photographs, you see that in the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s, there was the same collection of pictures of birthday parties, of people at the beaches, and if the editor were to assemble 1,000 of those black and white 3x5 images, it would have the same effect.
Right, yeah.
And in the days when there used to be something called magazines, there was the role of the editor. And I remember talking with Elliot Erwitt once, who had photographed a political scene only to find the editors at Life reposition it through cropping to give it a completely different meaning. And then he stopped shooting for them because he was showing that there were not a lot of people at Goldwater's rally, and they cropped it so it looked like there were a lot of them. And Ronald Reagan raised that to its pinnacle. So the role of the editor, I think, is one of the phenomenons that we're now looking at in terms of digital sublime. It is the vehicle of the internet and the technology of the digital that is really at play, perhaps even more so than the creative choice or creative action of the individual images.
Yeah. But I guess I wouldn't consider myself an editor. But I mean, is that what you? I mean, I agree with you, but I also think that it goes back to what Jim and Walter were talking about. Also, that as an artist, actually, I'm. You said something really nice. I wrote it down. Just the way it's phrased here: ambition to form. I have an ambition to form, and so I'm looking for things, I guess, that speak to me in those ways. So maybe I'm an editor on a certain level, but I also have to, I mean, I spend hours and hours and hours on one, like weeks and weeks. So there's something there that I'm picking at that is really interesting to me, which is why I would do it, which is maybe different than, to me, there's a neutralization in the term editor that I don't identify with. But I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you.
It's kind of interesting to me that one term, and I think Charlotte referred to this earlier today, that keeps cropping up all over the place is the word curating. I think people are curating lunch at this point, frankly. But it's funny that I see the word editor used less, but when it could be used in the same context, I think. But I wonder to what degree that suggests that people are less sensitive, perhaps, than they might be to the types of editorial choices that are made every time we decide to crop an image or to post an image or to juxtapose images. And I also do think that the internet raises really interesting questions about agency and the degree to which everyday people, not artists, not intellectuals necessarily, but people who are using images, putting them on Facebook and elsewhere, are beginning to rethink their relationship to that material and how it functions. Because previously, if you were a magazine editor, you theoretically had some professional skill and understood what you were doing for a particular audience, whereas now I think the internet, Flickr, Facebook, et cetera, gives individuals the opportunity, and often the term that is used is this word to curate, which obviously is a critical activity, but I think maybe connotes it a little bit less so than the word editing. So your question to me also raises some really interesting issues about how we understand images and their integrity and how we juxtapose those and the larger intentions behind them.
I mean, it seems that there's a warping and a dissolving. The other word that could be introduced would be the designer. Curator, editor, designer. That's the dynamic, the recipe that's sort of boiling away on the stove right now.
It's a great point. Thank you.
I want to thank Anne and Penelope for the talk.